Mr. Steve had everything a man could wish for: a luxurious life, a thriving business, a beautiful apartment in the heart of Maryland, and most importantly, a loving wife, Helen. Their marriage was 3 years strong, filled with love, respect, and understanding. Together they had a little boy, Daniel, who was the center of their world. Steve was a responsible man. Despite his busy schedule, he always found time for his family. He made it a rule to come home early, play with his son, and spend quality time with Helen. He knew that success wasn't just about money, it was about having a happy home too. Whenever he traveled for business, he would call his wife every night, making sure she and Daniel were doing fine. Helen adored her husband. She loved the way he cared for their family and how he respected her. She trusted him completely. Steve had never given her a reason to doubt him. Even when he was out with his friends, she knew he would always come back home to her. Steve had a group of friends he had known for years. They were fun, outgoing, and successful in their own way. But unlike Steve, most of them were unmarried, and those who were didn't take marriage seriously. They believed a man should enjoy life with different women, regardless of his marital status. Every Friday night, Steve and his friends would meet at an expensive bar, drinking and laughing about life. And every time, the conversation would turn into discussions about women. "Steve, you're too much of a family man," his friend Mark teased one evening, sipping his whiskey. "You should loosen up a bit. Life is too short to spend it with just one woman." Steve shook his head, smiling. "Come on, Mark. You guys know I love my wife. I don't play those games." His friends laughed. "It's not about love, Steve," another friend, Jake, said. "It's just about having fun. You're a man. You have the money, the status, and the looks. Women will throw themselves at you. It's just up to you to play your cards well." Steve still refused. He had never cheated on Helen, and he didn't plan to start. He had seen what affairs did to marriages, how they destroyed trust and peace. He was proud to be different. One evening, Steve and his friends gathered as usual at their favorite bar, a place known for its luxury and privacy. The music was soft, the drinks expensive, and the crowd sophisticated. Steve was enjoying his drink when Mark suddenly nudged him. "Steve, meet Janet," Mark said, pointing to a stunning woman who had just joined their table. Janet was breathtaking. She had long, silky black hair, flawless skin, and eyes that sparkled under the dim lights. She wore a red dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Steve felt a little uncomfortable as she smiled at him. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Steve," Janet said in a smooth, sweet voice. "Nice to meet you too," Steve replied politely, taking a sip of his drink. The conversation continued, but Steve found himself feeling uneasy. Janet was different. She wasn't just beautiful, she had a confidence and charm that made it hard to look away. Every time she spoke, her voice felt like a gentle melody. "You're the only married one here, right?" Janet asked, tilting her head slightly. Steve nodded. "Yes, and happily so." Janet smiled. "That's nice. It's rare to see loyal men these days." Steve felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was just a compliment, but something about the way she said it made him feel noticed. He shook off the thought. He loved Helen. There was no reason to entertain anything else. As the night went on, Janet was friendly but not too forward. She laughed at Steve's jokes, listened when he spoke, and occasionally placed a light touch on his arm while talking. When it was time to leave, she pulled out her phone. "Let's exchange numbers," she said with a smile. "I mean, just as friends." Steve hesitated for a second. He had never done this before. But she was just being friendly, right? There was nothing wrong with having a new friend. "Sure," he said, taking out his phone and saving her number. At first, nothing happened. Steve continued his normal routine: work, family, and business trips. But then a few days later, Janet texted him. "Janet. Hey, Mr. Businessman. Hope you're not too busy to reply to a friend." Steve smiled at the message. It was innocent. Just a simple text. "Steve, hey Janet. Just handling business as usual. Hope you're good." That was how it started. A few texts here and there. Then longer conversations. Janet was funny, smart, and knew exactly what to say. One evening she sent another message. "Janet, I was thinking about our talk the other night. You're such a rare kind of man, Steve. It's refreshing to meet someone like you." Steve felt his heart race slightly. It was just a message, but it felt nice. He ignored the strange feeling and replied casually. But deep inside, something was shifting. A week later, Janet invited Steve to her apartment. It's just dinner, she said over the phone. I promise I won't bite. Steve hesitated. He knew this was dangerous. But at the same time he told himself he could control the situation. I'll stop by but not for long, he finally said. That evening he drove to Janet's place. Her apartment was elegant, decorated with soft lights and a scent of vanilla in the air. She welcomed him with a warm smile. They talked, laughed, and drank a little wine. It felt easy, too easy. The conversation flowed, and for the first time in a long time Steve felt different. He wasn't just a husband or a businessman. He felt desired. Then it happened. Janet leaned in, her fingers brushing his hand. Steve, she whispered, looking into his eyes. We both know there's something here. Steve should have walked away. He should have thought about Helen, about Daniel. But at that moment something inside him ignored reason. He leaned in too. And just like that he crossed the line. When Steve left Janet's apartment that night his mind was spinning. He knew he had made a terrible mistake. He told himself it would be the last time. But deep down he knew the truth. Something had changed. And there was no turning back. Steve sat in his car outside Janet's apartment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was pounding. He had never done anything like this before. Guilt washed over him like a tidal wave. How could he have betrayed Helen? His beautiful, loving wife, the mother of his child? I'll end it here, he whispered to himself. This can't happen again. But deep inside he knew he was lying. The next day Steve tried to act normal. He kissed Helen before leaving for work, played with Daniel in the morning, and promised himself he would forget Janet. But it wasn't that simple. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Janet. Janet, thinking about last night. You were amazing. Steve stared at the message. His hands felt sweaty. He knew he should ignore it, block her number and move on. But instead he typed back. Steve, it was a mistake. We can't do this again. A few seconds later his phone buzzed again. Janet, are you sure? Steve didn't respond. He put his phone down and tried to focus on work. But his mind kept drifting back to Janet, the way she looked at him, the way she made him feel. By lunchtime he had already checked his phone 5 times, hoping she would message again. He didn't. And somehow that made him want her even more. That night Steve came home late. Helen was waiting for him in the living room, concern written all over her face. Hey, she said softly. You're late. Everything okay? Steve forced a smile. Yeah, just work. Long day. Helen nodded, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't convinced. She had always been able to read him. For the next few days Steve tried to avoid Janet. But the more he tried, the more he thought about her. He felt like a man trapped in a web, unable to escape. Then one evening he caved. I'm working late, he told Helen, kissing her on the forehead. Then instead of heading to the office he drove straight to Janet's apartment. That night everything changed. Steve stopped resisting. He stopped pretending he could control it. Instead he let himself fall deeper into Janet's world. Days turned into weeks and Steve was no longer the man he used to be. He started coming home late, sometimes past midnight. Other nights he didn't come home at all, telling Helen he had urgent business trips. He barely spent time with Daniel anymore. Helen noticed everything. She tried to push the doubts away, but something wasn't right. Steve was different. He smelled different, like a perfume she didn't own. He was always on his phone, smiling at messages he never shared. And worst of all, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her was fading. One evening Helen finally spoke up. Steve, she said, watching him from across the dinner table. Are you okay? You've been so distant lately. Steve barely looked up from his phone. I'm just stressed, Helen. Work is crazy. She wanted to believe him. But her heart told her otherwise. A few weeks later it was Daniel's 2nd birthday. Helen had planned a small family gathering, expecting Steve to be there. Daniel was excited, running around the house waiting for his dad. But Steve never showed up. Helen called him multiple times but he didn't answer. Hours later she received a text. Steve, sorry, something urgent came up. I'll make it up to you. What Steve didn't know was that Helen wasn't the only one waiting. Daniel, too, had been staring at the door, waiting for his father to walk in with a big smile and a present in his hand. Daddy's not coming? Daniel asked, his voice small. Helen forced a smile, holding back tears. He's busy, sweetheart. But he loves you. That night Helen cried herself to sleep. Something was pulling her husband away from their family. And she was afraid she already knew what it was. Helen became more observant. She noticed the way Steve would sneak out of bed at night to take calls. The way he would leave the room when his phone rang. And the way he never let her see his messages anymore. One night after Steve had fallen asleep, Helen reached for his phone. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it. And then, she saw it. A message from an unknown number. Janet, I can't wait for Valentine's Day. Our special night is going to be unforgettable. Same restaurant as last time? Top-notch restaurant. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Her worst fears were confirmed. Steve was having an affair. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't scream. She didn't wake him up. Instead, she placed the phone back beside him and lay down. He had to be smart about this. Steve wanted to play a game. She would play too. Helen lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed. The message from Janet replayed in her mind like a broken record. I can't wait for Valentine's Day. Our special night is going to be unforgettable. Her hands clenched into fists. How could Steve do this to her? To their family? For 3 years she had loved him with everything she had. She had trusted him blindly. And now he was sneaking around with another woman behind her back. But she wouldn't confront him yet. Well, she needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed proof. For the next few days Helen paid closer attention to Steve. Every move he made, every call he received, every lie he told, she saw it all. She noticed how he started dressing differently, wearing more expensive cologne, styling his hair with extra care. She saw how he smiled at his phone, completely lost in his own world. And she noticed something else. Jenna was calling him late at night. Even though Steve had told her not to. Helen pretended not to notice. But deep inside, every call felt like a knife to her heart. Then one evening she decided to test him. Steve, she said softly, sitting beside him on the couch. Valentine's Day is coming up. Do you have any plans for us? She watched his reaction closely. Steve barely looked up from his phone. I'll be on a business trip that day, he said casually. I'm meeting some investors out of town. Helen felt like the air had been knocked out of her chest. She already knew the truth, but hearing him lie to her face, it hurt more than she expected. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Oh, I see. Well, maybe we can celebrate when you get back. Steve nodded absent-mindedly. Yeah, sure. Helen looked at him, trying to find a trace of guilt, of hesitation, of anything that showed he still cared. But there was nothing. Her husband was slipping away from her. And now she had to make a choice. On Valentine's Day, Steve left home dressed in his finest suit, carrying his overnight bag. He kissed Helen on the cheek, told her not to wait up, and walked out the door without a second thought. Helen waited exactly 30 minutes before grabbing her car keys. She knew where he was going. The restaurant mentioned in Janet's text was one of the most expensive in town. Steve had taken her there before, back when they were still happy. Helen's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, driving toward the location. Her heart was pounding in her chest. What if she got there and saw something she couldn't handle? What if Steve looked at Janet the way he used to look at her? What if he was already gone? When Helen arrived, she parked her car a few blocks away and walked toward the restaurant. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, trying to steady her breathing. Through the large glass windows she scanned the crowd. And then, she saw them. Steve and Janet. Sitting at a candlelit table, laughing, drinking wine, looking like the perfect couple. Helen felt her stomach twist in pain. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. Every part of her body screamed for her to run, to disappear, to pretend she had never seen this. But she couldn't. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Steve was in the middle of a laugh when his eyes suddenly locked onto something. Or rather, someone. His face drained of color. Helen. She was standing just a few feet away, staring right at him. For a moment, time froze. Janet turned around, confused. When she saw Helen, her lips curled into an amused smirk. Well, well, Janet said, crossing her arms. Looks like someone crashed the party. Helen ignored her. Her eyes were only on Steve. You lied to me, she whispered, her voice shaking. You told me you were on a business trip. Steve opened his mouth, but no words came out. 3 years, Steve, Helen continued, her voice rising. 3 years of marriage, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with her, Janet rolled her eyes. Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. It's not like you're the first wife to be cheated on. That was it. Helen lunged. She didn't even think. Her body just moved. She grabbed Janet's arm, shoving her back. Stay away from my husband. Helen shouted, her voice echoing through the restaurant. Janet stumbled but quickly regained her balance. Oh, you wish I would, she spat. But here's the truth, sweetheart. Your husband came to me. He wanted me. Helen's vision blurred with rage. She didn't even see the wine bottle until it was too late. With a quick, violent swing, Janet smashed the bottle against Helen's head. Glass shattered. Helen's body crumpled to the floor. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Steve shot up from his chair, eyes wide with horror. Helen, he cried, dropping to his knees beside her. She wasn't moving. Blood trickled from her forehead onto the floor. Janet took one look at the scene, at the shocked faces of the other diners, at Steve screaming his wife's name, and without another word she turned and ran. She disappeared into the night. Steve lifted Helen's limp body into his arms, his hands trembling. Somebody call an ambulance, he shouted. Tears streamed down his face. For the first time the full weight of what he had done crashed down on him. He had ruined everything. And now he might lose the only person who ever truly loved him. The ambulance raced through the city streets, sirens wailing in the night. Steve sat in the back holding Helen's hand as she lay unconscious on the stretcher. Blood stained her forehead and her breathing was shallow. His hands trembled. His chest felt tight. Please, Helen. Don't leave me. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. At the hospital, doctors rushed Helen into the emergency room. Steve tried to follow but a nurse stopped him. You have to wait outside, sir. But, please, let us do our job. Steve stumbled backward, running a hand through his hair. His heart pounded in his chest. He had never been this scared in his life. Minutes turned into hours. He sat in the waiting room staring at the floor, drowning in guilt. His mind replayed everything. How he met Janet, how he let temptation win, how he lied over and over again. And now, the woman he had vowed to love and protect was fighting for her life. And it was all because of him. A few hours later the doctor finally came out. She's stable, he said. She had a deep cut on her forehead but there's no serious brain injury. She's going to be okay. Steve let out a shaky breath of relief. But then the doctor's face turned serious. But emotionally, she's hurt, Mr. Steve. Very hurt. She's awake but she doesn't want to see you right now. Steve's chest tightened. Can I at least talk to her? The doctor sighed. I think it's best to give her space for now. Just then the hospital doors burst open, and Helen's parents rushed in, panic written all over their faces. What happened to our daughter? Her mother demanded. Steve opened his mouth but the shame was too heavy. He couldn't find the words. Helen's father stepped closer, his eyes cold with disappointment. This is your fault, isn't it? Steve swallowed hard. He didn't try to deny it. Get out, Helen's mother snapped. Steve hesitated. But, get out. Steve's heart shattered. But he didn't argue. He simply turned and walked out of the hospital. For the next few days Helen stayed in the hospital. Steve called but she never picked up. He sent messages but she never replied. Back at home the silence was unbearable. Daniel kept asking, "Where's Mommy?" And Steve had no idea how to answer. When Helen was finally discharged, Steve was waiting at the front door hoping she would come home. But she didn't. Instead she went to her parents' house with Daniel. She didn't even look at Steve as she walked past him. And that was when Steve realized, this wasn't just a fight. This wasn't something a simple apology could fix. He had broken something. And he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. Steve sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the empty couch where Helen used to sit. The silence in the house was deafening. No laughter, no soft footsteps of his wife moving around, no giggles from Daniel playing with his toys. For the past week Helen had refused to talk to him. She had taken Daniel and moved to her parents' house. Steve had tried calling, sending messages, even showing up outside their door. But every time her parents shut him out. And deep inside he knew he deserved it. He had been a fool. A selfish, blind fool. Now he was paying the price. One night, unable to bear the loneliness, Steve walked into their bedroom. He sat on the bed, his hands gripping his hair. His eyes wandered to the dresser where Helen's pictures still stood. He picked up a framed photo of their wedding day. Helen was smiling so brightly, her eyes full of love and trust. Steve felt his chest tighten. She had given him everything, her heart, her loyalty, her life. And what had he done? Thrown it away for a cheap thrill. Tears burned in his eyes. He had been too arrogant to see what truly mattered. He had betrayed the one person who had loved him unconditionally. And now she was slipping away. Determined to fix his marriage, Steve went to Helen's parents' house the next morning. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. Helen's father answered, his expression cold. "What do you want?" "I need to see Helen," Steve said. "Please." Helen's father didn't move. "She doesn't want to see you. Please, just 5 minutes." Steve's voice cracked. "I need to talk to her. I need to fix this." There was a long pause. Then reluctantly Helen's father stepped aside. "Wait here," he said before disappearing into the house. Steve's hands were shaking. He had no idea what he was going to say. He just knew he couldn't lose her. A few moments later Helen appeared at the doorway. She was pale, thinner than before. There was no warmth in her eyes. Just pain. "What do you want, Steve?" she asked, her voice tired. Steve swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Helen. I know that's not enough, but I need you to know how much I regret everything. I was a fool. I let temptation destroy everything we built. But I love you. I love you and Daniel more than anything." Helen looked at him for a long moment. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have cheated." Steve flinched. "I know. And I hate myself for it." "Do you?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Do you really understand what you've done to me, Steve? Do you know how it feels to be lied to be betrayed by the person you trusted the most? To sit at home wondering why your husband doesn't want you anymore?" Steve felt like his heart was being ripped apart. "I was stupid," he whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'll do anything to earn it. Just, please don't give up on us." Helen wiped her tears away. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Steve." Her words felt like a knife to his soul. "I'll wait," he said. "I'll prove to you that I'm not that man anymore." Helen let out a shaky breath. "You need to leave." Steve nodded. He had hoped for a miracle, but deep down he knew this would take time. As he walked away, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't give up. He would fight for his family. Over the next few weeks, Steve did everything he could to change. He cut off all contact with Janet, blocking her number and deleting every trace of her from his life. He distanced himself from the friends who had encouraged his bad choices. Instead of going to bars, he went to therapy, trying to understand why he had been so weak. He started attending marriage counseling alone, hoping that one day Helen would join him. Most importantly, he became a better father. Even though Helen didn't let him come inside, he visited Daniel every day. He took him to the park, played with him, read him bedtime stories in the car before taking him back. Daniel was too young to understand everything, but he knew something was wrong. "Why doesn't Mommy come home, Daddy?" he asked one night. Steve's throat tightened. "Mommy's hurt, buddy. But Daddy's trying to make things right." Daniel thought for a moment. "You made Mommy cry?" Steve looked down, ashamed. "Yes. And I'm really sorry for it." Daniel climbed into his lap and wrapped his small arms around him. "Then say sorry, Daddy. If you say sorry, Mommy will come home." Steve hugged him tightly. If only it were that simple. One rainy evening, as Steve was getting ready for bed, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Helen. "Helen, can we talk?" His heart pounded. He grabbed his car keys and rushed to her parents' house. When he arrived, Helen was waiting for him outside. She was holding an umbrella, her expression unreadable. Steve stepped closer, his hands shaking. "Helen." She held up a hand. "I'm not ready to forgive you, Steve. I don't know if I ever will. But I've seen how hard you've been trying. And I appreciate that." Steve swallowed hard. "I'll never stop trying." Helen looked away, taking a deep breath. "I'm willing to try counseling. For Daniel's sake. But this doesn't mean we're back together." Steve nodded, his heart swelling with hope. "That's enough for me." Helen sighed. "One last thing, Steve. Anything. If you ever cheat on me again." She looked him straight in the eyes, her voice steady. "I will never look back." Steve felt a lump in his throat. "You won't have to. I promise." Helen studied him for a moment, then nodded. For the first time in weeks, Steve saw a flicker of warmth in her eyes. It wasn't love. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. The days that followed were not easy. Helen agreed to attend counseling with Steve, but she remained guarded, her heart still burdened with doubt and pain. At their first session, Helen sat with her arms crossed, avoiding Steve's gaze. The therapist, a calm woman with kind eyes, started the session by asking Helen how she felt. "I feel betrayed," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "I feel like the person I trusted the most shattered me. And now, I don't know if I can ever trust him again." Steve lowered his head. He had heard these words before, but they still cut through him like a knife. The therapist turned to Steve. "What do you want to say to Helen?" Steve took a deep breath. "I don't expect her to forgive me overnight. I don't even expect her to trust me right now. But I want her to know that I am not the man who made those terrible choices anymore. I want to be the husband and father she and Daniel deserve." Helen's fingers tightened around her lap. "You say that now. But what if, in a few months, you change again?" "I won't," Steve said firmly. "Because I know what it feels like to lose you. And I never want to feel that way again." Helen looked at him, searching his face for the truth. The therapist spoke again. "Rebuilding trust is not easy. It takes time, effort, and patience. But the fact that both of you are here means there's still something left to fight for." Helen exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I have the strength to fight for us." Steve reached out, hesitating before taking her hand. "Then let me fight for both of us." For the first time in weeks, Helen didn't pull away. After that, things moved slowly. Helen still lived at her parents' house, but she allowed Steve to spend more time with Daniel. They went to counseling every week, talking through the pain, the anger, the regrets. One day, after a session, as they walked to their cars, Helen turned to Steve. "Do you want to come over for dinner?" Steve blinked. "Dinner?" She nodded. "Daniel's been asking for you to eat with us." Steve felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. "Yes," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I'd love to." That night, as they sat at the table with Daniel chattering excitedly between them, Steve felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He knew he still had a long way to go. He knew Helen's heart was still healing. But for the first time he believed that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. A chance to start again. A chance to rebuild. A chance to love.